Welcome back to the deep dive. So we're looking at a moment in time that it just feels heavy, you
It
know?
does. Significant.
Yeah, significant. Like one of those dates that ends up in bold in the history books, the ones you have to memorize, not just the year, but the specific day, because everything kind of changed after that.
It really feels like we're living through one of those moments right now.
We are talking about February 2026. Um, Specifically, the events that just unfolded this past weekend, February 14th. We've got a pile of sources in front of us, articles, some on-the-ground reports, a lot of analysis, and they're all painting this picture of something happening in Munich, Germany.
Right.
And it's sending shockwaves, I mean real shockwaves, all the way to Tehran. The main source we're pulling from is titled The Mullahs' Reckoning. Reza Pahlavi takes his seat. And just the imagery in this piece is incredibly striking.
It is. And to really get the gravity of this, you have to absorb the specific sensory details coming out of Munich. It's Monday, February 16th, as we're talking. The source describes the chill air of the city. And it's carrying a sound that the leadership in Tehran has apparently feared for a very, very long time.
A synchronized roar. That's the phrase that just jumped off the page for me.
Exactly, a synchronized roar. And we need to be really clear about the scale here, because in geopolitics, numbers really, really matter. This isn't a few hundred people with some signs.
Yeah.
We are talking about more than 250,000 Iranians gathering in Munich alone.
Okay, I have to stop you there for a second. 250,000 people in one European city. That sounds, I mean, frankly, it sounds like hyperbole. We see protest numbers get inflated all the time in the media. Are we sure about that count?
It's a fair question, but the sources are being very specific here. You've got the Munich police estimates, which are usually conservative. You have aerial photography, analysis of public transit data. It all corroborates this massive, truly unprecedented turnout. This was not your standard Saturday afternoon rally. The reports describe it as a migration. People were flying in from all over Europe, driving overnight from, Sweden, Italy. It completely overwhelmed the city center.
That is just a staggering number for a single location, especially an expatriate community outside of their home country. But it wasn't only in Munich, was it? The reporting I'm seeing suggests this was a much bigger coordinated effort.
No, and that's the key. Munich was the epicenter, the main stage, but it wasn't the whole show. This was a global, coordinated event. While all this was happening in Germany, you had massive rallies unfolding at the exact same time in Los Angeles, in Toronto, in London, and a dozen other capital cities. When you tally it all up, the sources are estimating over 1 million voices, all rising up across continents on a single day.
Million people. That's not a protest anymore. That's a force of nature. It's like a demographic statement in real time.
It is.
And there's this specific visual element that the reports keep coming back to, and I really want to unpack it. They call it the forest of flags.
Yes, the lion and sun.
Right. So for anyone listening who might not be an expert on Iranian vexillology,
The study of flags, yeah.
can you explain the significance of that specific symbol? Because I think for a lot of us in the West, a flag is a flag.
Yeah.
But in this context, it feels like it's doing a lot of heavy lifting. It's obviously not the current flag of the Islamic Republic.
Oh, it's the furthest thing from it. And this is absolutely crucial to understanding the psychology of this moment. The current flag of Iran, the one you'd see at the UN or the Olympics, it has the stylized script of the word Allah in the center. It was introduced after the 1979 revolution.
Okay.
It represents the state's theological identity. It represents, the rule of the supreme leader.
It's a political statement.
Deeply. And now the flag flying in Munich, this forest of flags, is the lion and sun. This is the pre-revolutionary flag. But it's about more than just the monarchy. The symbol itself goes back centuries in Persian history. The lion represents strength, sovereignty, lineage. The sun represents illumination, wisdom, maybe even echoes of Mithraism.
So this is deeper than just the politics of the last 50 years.
Much, much deeper. It's civilizational. And here's a kicker. Inside Iran, under the current regime, this symbol is totally outlawed. If you're caught with one, you're in serious trouble.
Right.
But abroad, in the diaspora, it has been resurrected. It's become this emblem of what the source calls memory and defiance. It represents a direct connection to a history and identity that the current regime has spent almost half a century trying to erase.
So it's almost like a time machine. Or maybe a bridge to a different version of the country.
That is a perfect analogy. By flying that flag, those 1 million people are making a very clear statement. They're saying, we are a nation that existed long before 1979, and we will exist long after 1979. It's a fundamental rejection of the idea that Iran is the Islamic Republic.
It separates the country from the regime.
Precisely. Seeing a literal forest of them in Munich is a visual, visceral rejection of the last 47 years of theocratic rule.
And you use the word rejection, which is interesting because the source makes a very specific point about what this crowd was demanding. Or maybe more importantly, what they weren't demanding. Usually protests have a list of asks, right?
Yeah.
Lower the price of gas, stop the censorship, free political prisoners.
And that is the crucial pivot point. For years, decades even, you'd hear slogans asking for reform. Let's fix the system from within. Or asking for better economic conditions, or for the morality police to be disbanded.
Right.
The reporting on this event from every source we have is crystal clear. They were not asking for reform, they were demanding an end.
The end. That's a very different negotiating posture. That's not, please fix the potholes in our street. That's, get out of the building and give us the keys.
It is. It's a non-negotiable position.
Right.
And that brings us directly to the protagonist of this whole story, the figure who was standing at the center of the storm in Munich, Reza Pahlavi.
The exiled crown prince, the son of the late Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi.
Correct. And his presence there, in that specific role, at that specific moment, represents a massive shift. The source uses this really compelling framework to describe his political journey up to this point. It talks about how, for decades, Pahlavi has been living in the political margins.
I loved how they put this. They called it a political Goldilocks problem. Can we break that down? Because I think a lot of people just assume, oh, he's the prince, so of course he's always been the leader of the opposition. But that's not really true, is it?
Not at all. For the longest time, he was stuck in this impossible political position. If you looked at the staunch Republicans, the people who maybe even supported the 1979 revolution at first because they wanted democracy.
Right, they just wanted to get rid of the Shah.
For them, he was too royal. They hear the name Pahlavi and they just think of his father. They think of the secret police, Savak. They couldn't get past the title of crown prince.
So for them, he represents a return to the past, not a path to the future.
Exactly. But then you look at the other side of the spectrum, the hardline monarchists, the people who lost everything in 79 and just want the old days back exactly as they were.
Okay.
For them, he was too reformist.
Too soft.
In a way, yeah. Because he's constantly talking about democracy, he talks about human rights, about referendums. He doesn't act like a king who's just waiting to rule by decree. And then, of course, to the Islamists and the current regime in Tehran, he was too secular.
So he just didn't fit neatly into any of the established boxes. He was kind of politically homeless.
That's a great way to put it. He's been this well-known figure, a symbol, but maybe not a mechanism for change, not a driver of policy.
Right.
But the source makes this profound point about how history actually works. It says, and I'm quoting here, "Moments of history can reorder hierarchies overnight." Munich, February 14th, 2026, it seems, was the moment that the entire hierarchy got reordered. He moved from the margins right to the center of the board.
So why now? What was the catalyst? Did he change, or did the circumstances around him change so dramatically?
The world changed. The Iranian street changed. And it really comes down to one word: consolidation. For the first time since the 1979 revolution, the opposition isn't just energized and angry. It's what the source calls consolidated around a single, recognizable figure.
And you have to understand, the Iranian opposition has historically been famous for being fractured.
Infamously fractured. You had the leftists, you had the monarchists, you had different ethnic groups, the Kurds, the Balochs, all sort of pulling in their own directions.
And the regime in Tehran loves that, right? That's dictatorship 101, divide and conquer.
It's been their greatest insurance policy for over 40 years. As long as the opposition is busy fighting with each other, they aren't an effective threat to the regime. But Munich seems to show that those old divisions are being set aside, at least for now, for a much greater goal.
And a lot of that seems to be about Pahlavi's specific public stance. We should probably clarify what he's actually saying, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding out there.
There is.
Yeah, I think when people hear Crown Prince, they just automatically assume he wants to march into Tehran, put the crown on, sit on the peacock throne, and start ruling.
And that is precisely what he is not saying. And this is why that Goldilocks problem seems to have resolved itself. The source puts a huge emphasis on his referendum promise. He's made it very clear time and again that he does not seek absolute rule. He sees his own role as that of a transitional figure.
So he's the bridge, but not necessarily the destination on the other side.
Precisely. His entire commitment, his whole platform, is to facilitate a referendum that allows the Iranian people to choose their own system of government, whether that ends up being a constitutional monarchy like in the UK, or a republic like France, or something else entirely.
He's saying that's for you, the people, to decide.
My job is just to get us to the point where we can have that free and fair decision.
That's an incredibly powerful message. It sort of takes all the ammunition away from the people who claim he just wants to be another dictator. It's almost selfless, or at the very least, extremely politically pragmatic.
It's very astute. It broadens the tent massively. If you're a Republican, you can get behind him because he's promising a vote where you can choose a republic. If you're a monarchist, you support him because you hope the vote goes your way. It unifies all these disparate groups under one simple banner: the transition.
And in politics, as the source notes, perception often precedes reality. What happened in Munich signaled to Tehran, and just as importantly to the international community, that Reza Pahlavi is no longer just a claimant to a defunct throne.
No.
He's now a negotiating actor. He has a clear mandate from the street, 1 million people's worth of a mandate.
That changes the entire geopolitical equation. He now has the political capital to sit across the table from world leaders and potentially from elements within the regime, and credibly speak for a huge portion of the nation.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We really need to unpack this Mullahs reckoning. We need to understand what has changed so fundamentally, what this proposed transition plan actually is, because there's a very specific plan on the table, and what this stark choice is that Tehran is now facing. It really does seem to be a choice between negotiation and total collapse.
That is the binary they are facing, and it's a terrifyingly narrow window of opportunity.
But of course, we can't really talk about the protagonist of this story without talking about the antagonist, the regime, the Islamic Republic.
The survivor.
They really are survivors, aren't they? I mean, if you look at the history, people have been predicting their collapse for a long, long time. Every few years, there's another wave of protests. Pundits get on TV and say, this is it, this is the end, and then it's not.
Decades of survival, and it's so important to acknowledge that resilience, otherwise we risk underestimating them even now. Under Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, they have weathered some incredible storms. Just think about the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s. 8 years of brutal trench warfare, chemical weapons, 1 million casualties on their side. They survived that.
And war like that usually cements a revolutionary regime, doesn't it? It forges a new national identity around the struggle.
It absolutely did. Then came the 1999 student movement. That was crushed. Then the 2009 Green movement. Millions of people in the streets peacefully asking, where is my vote?
Also crushed.
Brutally.
And of course, more recently, the 2022 nationwide protests sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini. That was a cultural revolution in the streets, women burning their headscarves. The regime survived that too.
So the natural question a listener is probably asking, and it's a question I'm asking, is why is this time different? Why are we sitting here in February 2026 saying they are on the brink now? What finally cracked?
To understand that, we have to look at their methodology of survival and see why those old tools are starting to fail them. Historically, they relied on a very specific toolkit of repression. You have the Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC, you have the Basij militia, those plainclothes enforcers on motorcycles.
You have the horror of places like Evin Prison. They controlled the elections. They criminalized any real dissent. And that worked until it didn't.
The source uses this phrase, internal brittleness.
Yes. The regime is currently facing what you could call a trifecta of vulnerabilities that they've never had to face all at once in this combination before. It's the perfect storm. First, you have catastrophic economic decay.
We always hear the phrase mismanagement and sanctions. But let's get specific. What does that actually mean for the average person living in Isfahan or Tehran?
It means the complete death of the middle class. We are seeing surging, runaway inflation, and the total collapse of the national currency, the ruble. When your currency becomes essentially worthless paper, the social contract between the state and the citizen just breaks.
Right.
Imagine you're a teacher or a nurse or a factory worker. You get paid in a currency that loses value every single day you hold it. You can't buy meat, you can't afford medicine for your parents, you can't plan for tomorrow.
So it pushes people from being just unhappy with the government to being truly desperate.
Exactly. And desperate people do things that merely scared people won't do. When you have absolutely nothing left to lose, the threat of a prison sentence starts to lose its sting. But that's the economic layer. Then you have the second vulnerability, the demographic disconnect. This is huge.
Describe that for us. Who are we talking about here?
Tehran has a very, very young population.
Yeah.
These young Iranians, kids in their teens and 20s, are highly educated. They're digitally connected despite all the government censorship. They use VPNs. They're on Instagram. They see the world. They know what life looks like in Dubai, in Istanbul, in Seoul.
They're globally aware.
Completely. And they feel, as the source puts it, trapped in a system that felt frozen in time.
It's a fundamental generational clash.
It's an extreme one. I mean, imagine you're a 22-year-old software engineer in Tehran. You want to build startups, you want to travel, you want to date freely, you want to listen to the music you like, and your entire country is being run by men in their 80s who are obsessed with enforcing dress codes and ideologies from half a century ago. The cognitive dissonance is just unbearable.
It's a pressure cooker.
And the lid is welded shut. That's the disconnect. And then you have the third vulnerability, which is the axis of resistance backlash.
This is the external part of their strategy, funding groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen.
For decades, the regime projected its power by funding these proxy groups. This was their foreign policy shield. The idea was to fight the enemy abroad so you don't have to fight them at home. But that costs money.
An extraordinary amount of money.
Billions and billions of dollars. Money that isn't being spent on fixing the economy in Tehran.
Right. And the people on the street, they know that. They see it.
They know it, and they're angry about it. One of the most common chants we've heard in protests for years now is, "No Gaza, no Lebanon, my life for Iran." They are furious that their national wealth is being squandered on foreign wars while they can't afford rent.
So it's not just the financial cost, it's the political cost at home. It has isolated them from their own people.
Exactly. So you put it all together, you have a regime that is internally brittle, externally overstretched, and economically on its knees. And now, for the first time, unlike in 2009 or 2022, they are facing a unifying alternative in the form of Reza Pahlavi.
That's the new variable, the one that was missing in all of the previous equations.
Correct. In previous protests, there was no clear plan B. It was just anger at what existed. Now, there is a face, a flag, and crucially, a plan for what comes next.
Okay, so let's get into that plan. If the regime is truly on the ropes, what's the proposed way out? Because history shows us that these kinds of regimes don't just, pack their bags and leave. The source outlines what it calls a bloodless path, a proposed transition plan. And I want to get into the details of this because it's surprisingly specific. It's not just vague hope.
No, it's a structured roadmap, and it begins with a clear historical precedent. The source argues that authoritarian systems almost never reform themselves voluntarily. They don't just wake up one day and say, you know what, we were wrong.
Right.
But negotiated transitions can happen. They happen when the elites inside the system realize that total repression risks total collapse.
The examples given in the source are Spain after Franco died and South Africa at the end of apartheid.
And they're both excellent examples. In both of those cases, the old guard, the Francoist generals in Spain, the National Party leadership in South Africa, they looked at the situation and realized that if they kept fighting to the bitter end, they would lose everything, probably including their own lives. But if they negotiated, they could secure a transition that didn't completely destroy the country or themselves.
So the binary choice for the leadership in Tehran right now is a managed transition versus an uncontrolled implosion.
That's the menu. And according to this analysis, there are no other options on it.
So let's walk through this proposal pillar by pillar. Pillar number one, the 50-50 interim national unity government.
This is the core mechanism of the entire plan.
Okay, I have to stop you right there. 50-50. You are telling me that the plan being put forward is to offer the very people who have been beating protesters, the people running this theocracy, half the seats in a new government. That sounds naive at best. Why would the opposition ever agree to that? And why would the regime ever accept only half?
It sounds completely counterintuitive, I know. But you have to think about the game theory here. If you're the opposition and your opening offer is, we're taking 100% of the power on day one and you're all going on trial, what does the regime do?
They fight to the last bullet.
They fight to the last bullet. They have zero incentive to stop shooting. They're fighting for their very survival. By offering them a 50% stake, you're creating what some strategists call a golden bridge. You're telling the technocrats, the army generals, the bureaucrats who just want the country to function, you have a future here. We need you.
You're trying to split the regime.
Precisely. You are peeling away the pragmatists from the hardcore ideologues. This interim government, according to the plan, would only last for 12 months.
And who would actually sit in these seats? Who gets to choose?
The composition would be a careful split. Half would be representatives from the current regime, obviously not the hardliners who have blood on their hands, but the managers, the experts, the people who know how to keep the power grid running. And the other half would be composed of opposition figures, led by Reza Pahlavi.
But that's got to be a delicate dance.
Yeah.
Please come sit at this table next to the guy who worked for the government that had you under surveillance for 20 years.
It is. It's incredibly difficult. But look at the mandate of this interim government. It has 3 very specific, limited goals. 1, stabilize the economy, stop the hyperinflation, get food back on the shelves. That benefits everybody.
Okay.
2, guarantee civil liberties, stop the arrests, open up the internet, release political prisoners. And 3, prepare for internationally monitored elections.
This is limited time offer. It's a caretaker government, not a permanent one.
Yes. Its only job is to bridge the gap between the Islamic Republic and whatever the Iranian people choose to come next. It's not there to rule forever.
And the end game for this 12-month government.
Its final act is to oversee the election of a constituent assembly. That new elected body would then be tasked with drafting a new secular democratic constitution, which would then be put to a national referendum for the entire country to vote on.
So the logic here is to create a bridge rather than a rupture.
Exactly. You want to preserve state continuity while enabling fundamental change. You keep the lights on, you keep the water running, the bureaucracy continues to function while you replace the political software.
Right.
If you just fire everyone on day one, the entire country collapses into chaos. We saw a version of that in Iraq after the U.S. invasion with de-Baathification. They fired the entire state apparatus, and the country fell into a brutal insurgency. This plan is designed specifically to avoid the Iraq scenario.
That makes a lot of pragmatic sense. It might be painful and hard to swallow for some, but it's pragmatic.
Okay, that brings us to pillar number 2, immediate strategic freezes. This seems to be geared more towards the international community. It is. This is the part of the plan designed to stop the rest of the world from panicking during the transition. Because let's be very honest, a revolution in a country the size and importance of Iran scares the hell out of every global capital from Washington to Beijing.
Why specifically?
Oil and nukes. It's really that simple. If Iran descends into chaos, what happens to its nuclear program? Do materials go missing? What happens to its advanced ballistic missiles?
So this pillar is meant to address those fears head on.
Immediately. The proposal calls for 3 simultaneous moratoriums. First, an immediate halt to the nuclear program. Freeze the centrifuges, allow full IAEA inspections. Second, an immediate halt to ballistic missile expansion and testing.
And third?
And third, an immediate halt to all financial and military support for foreign proxy groups.
So you turn off the money tap to Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis on day 1.
Yes. And the argument is that these freezes remain in place for the entire 12-month transition. The long-term policy, like whether a future democratic Iran ever wants a nuclear program, that's not for the interim government to decide. That's for a future democratically elected government to debate. But for now, freeze everything.
That makes a lot of sense. It buys you immediate goodwill with Europe and the United States. It signals to them, we are the adults in the room now.
It lowers the regional temperature dramatically. It tells the world we are busy fixing our own house. We are not a threat to you right now. It's a key step to preventing foreign intervention.
Now, pillar number 3. This one feels
Yes.
like the most difficult one to pull off emotionally. Truth and reconciliation.
This is the hardest part, without a doubt.
Because revolutions have this nasty habit of, devouring their own. You get rid of the tyrant, and then you risk becoming the tyrant. You start seeing show trials and people getting hanged from cranes.
Revenge is an incredibly powerful and dangerous drug. And the entire philosophy of this pillar is about avoiding that trap. It's about finding a way to have accountability without letting it descend into pure vengeance. But try explaining that to a mother whose son was shot dead in a protest last year.
Exactly. She wants justice. She wants the person who pulled the trigger and the person who gave the order to pay.
So how do you possibly balance those two needs? The mechanism proposed is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, likely modeled on the one in post-apartheid South Africa. It would be tasked with investigating abuses, specifically from the protest crackdowns. It would identify the individuals responsible for torture and extrajudicial killings.
But here's the compromise part. And this is where it gets really sticky and controversial.
The compromise is offering conditional amnesty to what the source calls lesser offenders in exchange for their full disclosure.
So tell us everything you did and who gave the orders, and we won't put you in jail.
Essentially, yes. For the foot soldiers, the low-level bureaucrats, the people who are just following orders but didn't personally commit atrocities. The reality is, you need some of those people to help you build the new state. You can't put half the country's government employees in prison.
That is the South African model, isn't it? The one led by Desmond Tutu.
It is. And it was incredibly painful. It was imperfect. A lot of people felt that true justice wasn't served. But it almost certainly prevented a bloody civil war between the white minority and the black majority.
Right.
The rationale here is that justice must be firm, but it can't be indiscriminate if you want stability. If every single member of the Basij militia thinks they're going to be executed, they'll grab their AK-47s and they will fight in the streets to the death. If they think they might have a chance to go home and live a quiet life if they confess, maybe they put the gun down.
It's an incredibly mature, forward-thinking approach. The big question is whether it can be swallowed by a public that is justifiably very, very angry.
That is the ultimate gamble of this entire plan. But the alternative is a cycle of revenge that just never ends. You just have to look at places like Syria or Libya to see what happens when there is no plan for reconciliation.
So that's the three-pillar plan. A 50-50 power-sharing government, strategic freezes on weapons programs, and a truth commission. Now let's get into the strategic calculation. Why would any of the key players actually agree to this? Let's start with the regime. Why on earth would they negotiate what looks like their own surrender?
It looks like surrender, but as the source compellingly argues, it might actually be preservation.
How so? Preservation of what?
If you're a regime insider right now, a general or a minister, you're looking at the math. The economy is dead. The youth of the country despise you. The world is squeezing you with sanctions. You have two choices. Go down fighting and lose everything, or negotiate a transition where you get to keep something.
What do they get to keep in this scenario?
First and foremost, they save their personal safety. They don't get dragged through the streets like Gaddafi in Libya. They save a degree of institutional continuity. The army as an institution still exists, the civil service still exists, and they save national unity, preventing the country from shattering.
It's the lifeboat argument. The ship is sinking. Here is a guaranteed seat on a lifeboat. It might not be a first-class seat like you're used to, but it floats.
Exactly. And the alternative is going down with the ship.
Okay, now for the opposition. Why should they negotiate with the very people who have impressed them for decades? Why not just wait for the regime to collapse and then storm the palace?
Pragmatism. Storming the palace is bloody, it's unpredictable, and it's not the end of the story. What happens the day after you storm the palace? Who runs the power grid? Who manages the currency? Who makes sure the ports are operating?
They need the expertise that exists within the state.
They need the state machinery to function. Pahlavi brings the name recognition, the symbolism, the international access. But the opposition also knows that they need the state itself to survive the transition.
The source does mention a key caveat for the opposition, though. It warns that this can't just be the Reza Pahlavi show.
Yes, that's critical. The unity has to extend far beyond just symbolism. It can't just be about him as a prince. It must actively embrace the women's rights activists, the labor leaders, the ethnic minorities, the students, the technocrats. If this is perceived as just a restoration of the old monarchy without including these new, modern elements of Iranian society, it will fail.
So Pahlavi has to be the conductor of an orchestra, not the soloist.
That is a perfect way to put it.
And finally, the international perspective. Why does the rest of the world care so much? I mean, beyond the obvious human rights concerns, in pure realpolitik terms, why does China care? Why does Europe care? Why does the U.S. care?
Because what happens in Iran never, ever stays in Iran. Iran is a geopolitical keystone. It directly impacts global energy markets, the oil prices. If Iran's production goes offline chaotically, gas prices could skyrocket everywhere. It touches regional security, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the entire Gulf. Nuclear non-proliferation, that's a huge one, obviously. And then there's the issue of refugee flows.
That's a massive concern for Europe, especially.
Huge. If Iran implodes into a full-blown civil war, you could see millions of refugees flooding towards Turkey and then into Europe. The European migration crisis of 2015 would look like a small dress rehearsal in comparison. The world has a massive vested interest in a managed transition, not a chaotic collapse.
So the source has a clear call to action for diplomats here.
It does. It says they need to quietly prepare channels. Don't make loud speeches about it, but start making the phone calls. Start preparing the diplomatic landing zone for a negotiated transition. Signal to the pragmatic elements within the regime that there is a way out if they are brave enough to take it now.
We've spent a lot of time talking about the plan, the bloodless path.
Yeah.
But we have to talk about the alternative. The source calls it Very starkly, the abyss. What happens if Tehran just says no? What happens if Khamenei looks at this plan, laughs, and tears it up?
Then we enter the realm of the nightmare factors. If there is a sudden, violent collapse without any plan in place, you risk immediate factional infighting within the security services themselves. The Revolutionary Guard isn't a monolith. Different factions could start fighting each other for control of oil fields, ports, and other assets.
You get warlordism.
Exactly. And then you have the eruption of long-suppressed ethnic tensions. Iran is a very diverse country. You have the Kurds in the west, the Blocs in the east, Arabs in the south. Without a legitimate central government, those regions could try to break away.
You risk the balkanization of Iran, the country shattering into pieces.
Absolutely. And that leads to massive refugee flows that destabilize all of Iran's neighbors. And then you have armed militias competing for control in the power vacuum. It could turn into Syria, but on a much larger, more strategically important, and more dangerous scale.
And inevitably, in that scenario, external powers get involved.
It becomes a playground for global proxy wars. Russia, China, the US, the Gulf states. Everyone tries to back their own faction and take a slice of the pie. It's an absolute tragedy.
The source uses a dam analogy here that really stuck with me.
Yes. It says a system relying on force is like a dam cracking from internal pressure. It may appear solid until it failed all at once. That is the fundamental warning. Revolutions that don't have a negotiated off-ramp so often spiral into this kind of uncontrollable chaos.
It's such a chilling thought, the idea that stability is just an illusion right up until the very moment that it isn't.
That's the nature of these brittle authoritarian systems. They look incredibly strong and permanent until the day they just evaporate. Look at the Soviet Union in 1991. Look at the Shah's own regime in 1979. It seemed impossible until it happened.
So we're coming towards the end of this deep dive, and I kind of want to zoom out for a second. The source has this section titled, "The Clock is Ticking."
It reflects on the sheer duration of the Islamic Republic, nearly half a century. Whole generations have been born and have died under this one system. But the source makes this incredibly profound point. Legitimacy is not measured in years, but in consent. You can rule for 500 years, but if you lose the consent of the people you govern, you have nothing left but force.
Hit February 14, 2026, this synchronized roar from 1 million people seems to be the day that the withdrawal of that consent became visible, audible, and undeniable.
It feels like the turning point, not because power actually changed hands that day Khamenei is still in his palace in Tehran as we speak, but because, as the source puts it, political gravity shifted, the energy moved, the fear moved.
The fear changed sides.
Exactly. The regime is now more afraid of its people than the people are of the regime, and that is a fundamental change.
And it changes Reza Pahlavi's status.
He now occupies a seat at the table of history. Whether Tehran chooses to acknowledge that seat is another matter entirely, but the seat is there. The people put it there for him.
So we come back to that final choice. The source puts it so beautifully.
The two paths, dialogue and a managed dissent on one side, versus force and the abyss on the other. It talks about these moments in history as windows of transformation.
Narrow openings that, when closed, rarely reopen gently. That is a haunting phrase.
It really is, because nations are sometimes offered these windows, these brief chances to change course without destroying everything. Iran is standing right in front of one of those windows right now. They can choose to open it and climb through to something new, or they can slam it shut and just wait for the glass to inevitably shatter.
So that brings us to the final provocative thought, the thing for our listeners to really mull over. The source says, Tehran must decide whether to negotiate the future or be overtaken by it.
And I would ask the listener to consider this. We in the West often root for the fall of dictators. It feels just. It feels like the end of a movie. But if that dam in Iran breaks, and there is no plan, no bridge, no managed transition, is the world actually ready for what comes next? Are we ready for a chaotic, fractured, possibly nuclear-armed Iran? Because the vacuum of power is often far scarier and far deadlier than the abuse of power.
A very sobering thought to end on. Negotiation isn't sexy, it's not as cinematic as storming the palace, but it might be the only thing that can save the country from itself.
Indeed. It's the difference between a controlled demolition of an old building and that same building just collapsing on top of everyone who lives inside.
That's it for this deep dive into the Mullahs' reckoning. We will be watching the news out of Tehran and other world capitals very closely in the coming weeks to see if anyone is brave enough to take that first step onto the bridge. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.